Hello, what's up, Dragonfly Swarm? I was given the opportunity to test out the new Unknowable Domain game mode in the Simulated Universe, and it really shed some light not only on the direction that Hoyoverse seems to be taking with certain in-game content, but also what that means for the meta and for the player base, all of which things I want to talk about today. This game mode is a creative and really accessible spin on the gameplay currently available in the Simulated Universe, and it adds an element that I didn't expect to enjoy as much as I did, and there are some really nice implications for free-to-play players of Honkai Star Rail, so let's talk about all of that. Unknowable Domain is a brand new game mode in the Simulated Universe, kind of like Swarm Disaster or Golden Gears, but it has its own very distinct mechanics which set it apart from the other two game modes, and there are some cool things to note about that. The entire premise of Unknowable Domain is to build your teams and your playstyles around these things called scepters. Think of a scepter kind of like your weapon. In any given run, you can equip up to 3 unique scepters, and any given scepter has its own special requirements for triggering its extremely powerful attacks on enemies. Some scepters you have to charge up by doing things like applying DOT to enemies, some you have to charge up by breaking weakness bars, and some even get their own set speeds in the turn queue, which you can then augment further with components and curios. Components are a lot like blessings in other game modes, except instead of buffing your team, these things are buffing and building the scepters that you obtain. And this all leads up to you dispatching waves of enemies extremely fast, because as you'll notice, this game mode only gives you 2 cycles in combat before enemies go berserk, so the entire goal is to get good components, build your scepters so that your team can maximize how often or how hard they strike, and then make your way to the final boss to clear the domain and grab your rewards. The added and unique difficulty here is that you have a limited number of cycles to clear each domain before enemies start scaling up, gaining lots of speed and lots of damage. At heart, this game mode is much like other simulated and divergent universe gameplay. It's Hoyoverse's spin on roguelike games with a playground for you to bring your toughest characters for very tough playthroughs, especially if you start playing through the conundrum levels of Unknowable Domain, where things get extremely difficult and require you to really know how to build the best scepter loadout for your team. But the difference and the really cool thing is that the primary focus of this game mode is not really on how strong or expensive your team is, but rather how effectively you can craft scepter builds to make the most of the teams you do have. In other words, Unknowable Domain provides a very interesting experience wherein you can find a lot of value by bringing the game's strongest characters to help with charging scepters and creating a good build for any given playthrough, but lower cost, generally less powerful characters get a lot of leeway because the focus is not entirely on how strong they can be, but rather how strong your scepter builds can be. So what does this mean for the meta of Unknowable Domain, and how will this affect you? This game mode takes a lot of pressure off of needing to rely on powerful characters who can brute force their way through content, and rather puts that pressure on your ability to cleverly build a team around enabling your scepters. This means that although the ground is obviously still not entirely equal, there is a much more equal footing between free-to-play characters and high spenders, which you may find particularly enjoyable since you can get over 2100 stellar jades just by playing through this game mode and completing content in it. It's a much more accessible alternative to brutal game modes like Divergent Universe, which can get extremely tough for players who don't have premium sustained characters. For example, Aventurine or Fushuan to prevent getting one-shot, or characters like Firefly and Acheron to brute through inconceivably large enemy HP pools. This isn't to say the game mode is easy though, because in higher difficulties of Unknowable Domain, you must rely less and less on your ability to brute force the content and must rely much more on understanding scepters and builds to effectively clear the content. It equally incentivizes all players to use their brains and actually create cool builds and watch their scepters nuke through bosses or shred through hordes of enemies. And this is extremely apparent at Conundrum 6, wherein your scepters can be doing tens of millions of damage every single turn and still hardly dent the enemies. Suddenly, you need to understand the game mode rather than trusting that your dinky Acheron or Firefly team can just walk in and do it all for you. And honestly, that's part of the charm that I found so appealing with this game mode. Using the right scepter builds, you can work with just about any team in the game and find success even at Conundrum 6, and there's actually a really interesting strategy by Sweetly that has proven to be extremely valuable regardless of your team comp or investment level, which I will discuss now. You might be wondering the most convenient and easiest way to complete this game mode, either because you're a completionist or a freak for stellar jades, but luckily there is a way. When you play through Unknowable Domain, you may choose between one of 4 alignments centered around ultimate damage, DOT damage, break damage, or follow-up damage, and essentially what you're doing when you select one of these alignments is you're choosing to see more builds, scepters, and components that will complement that playstyle in your next run. And that brings me to the really powerful strategy that Sweetly came up with, break-based scepter teams. When you align yourself with break for a playthrough, you'll see lots of scepters and components focused around dishing out massive toughness damage, amplifying your team's break modifiers, granting them weakness break efficiency, etc. The cool coolest part, though, is that one of the components for these break scepters is called Rupture Countdown, and it essentially allows your scepter to grant your entire team the ability to deal super break damage, kinda like HMC does. That means without even needing to run a super break team, say with characters like Firefly, HMC, Rappa, etc., you can have full access to the massive modifiers of super break damage, and your team can constantly break enemies to keep them from attacking you while you and your scepters whittle them down. It's a brilliant strategy, and it allows you to play much safer at Conundrum 6, where enemies tend to one-shot your characters and tank through hundreds of millions of damage. The coolest part, in my opinion, though, is that there are a lot of components, curios, and scepter buffs that allow you to turn pretty much any team in the game into a fully functional break team in this game mode, allowing them to fully enjoy the benefits of the break team archetype, which ironically feel almost required in order to complete Conundrum 6 of Unknowable Domain. Now with that said, I want to teach you some of the most powerful ways to build this playstyle, but keep in mind that just like with any Simulated Universe playthrough, it's nearly impossible to get exactly one specific build, so you'll just need to focus on the core pieces of these break team builds and use whatever you're given to the best of your ability. For the break archetype, your best builds will revolve around setting your scepters into a perpetual loop of actions, and you can do this by starting out with a core of 2 charge scepters and 1 speed scepter. For your 2 charge scepters, you'll have these 3 options to pick from, but I've found the most success with Sealing and Denouement, because they are not only far easier to reliably charge up, but Sealing provides significant DPS and provides useful energy restoration and action advancement utility for your team. Reversal can work, but it's a bit harder to charge up if you're not running teams that can break toughness bars easily, like Firefly with her weakness implant or Rappa with her universal toughness reduction. As for your singular speed scepter, you have these 3 options at your disposal, and frankly, they're all really good. You can't really go wrong with any of them, so just pick whichever you find first. But generally speaking, I found the most success with Open because it deals a lot of toughness reduction and damage, plus it has a mechanic which increases your team's speed by a significant amount the more enemies it hits, and even if you're in single target, it deals a crazy amount of damage. However, it's worth noting that if you're running a team that cannot implant weakness or break toughness bars with universal reduction damage, you'll probably want to aim for Null instead, because when it attacks, it implants weakness for your team, which is invaluable in some scenarios. The reason why you're specifically choosing 2 charge scepters and 1 speed scepter is because you'll want to make them trigger each other on a loop, and I'll explain how that works. Firstly, you're going to want to equip your charge scepters with components that allow them to charge up much faster, then equip your speed scepter with components that simply increase its amplification. Using certain decision components such as Distortion Vortex, you'll allow your charge scepters to trigger an immediate attack from your speed scepter, who, when also equipped with certain decision components, can then in turn restore charge to your charge scepters, creating what is essentially a long-lasting loop of your scepters just taking actions and pummeling through enemies. This is a strategy that was created by an HSR creator named Sweetly, and it essentially acts as your endgame goal to achieve for when you take on the final boss in your Unknowable Domain run. You should note very importantly that for the first plane and often even the second plane, your scepters won't be dishing out significantly more damage than your teammates, so you'll still need to bring a cohesive and capable team to help through the first few domains you come across. But after a certain point, when you've established your scepters with good components, you'll notice a sudden power spike wherein they begin carrying your damage. And by the time you reach the third and final plane, your scepters should be easily triggered, running looped actions, and constantly delaying the enemies while dealing massive break damage and also allowing your team to deal considerable break damage. The final thing I want to discuss are some of the teams that I found the most success with when using Sweetly's break build strategy for Conundrum 6. Obviously, any sort of Firefly or Rappa team variant that I played was immensely successful, and I rarely had trouble completing the run so long as my builds came together properly by the third plane. These characters are complemented greatly by the break scepters, and that's kind of a no-brainer, so if you have them, definitely bring them to your playthrough, and you'll notice your early game ends up much stronger, leading to an even stronger final plane. I also had considerable success with teams revolving around follow-ups, specifically because it let me run this charge scepter super effectively, and characters like Himiko, Herta, and March 7th Hunt capitalize surprisingly well on the massive break utility that your scepters can provide in this game mode, making them really strong options that can clear even Conundrum 6. I also occasionally ran Shuei teams, and while Shuei herself didn't feel that useful beyond the universal toughness reduction on her ultimate, she's still viable, and with proper teammates can still help bring your scepters online for your final fights later in the run, so long as your builds are very solid. Also, in terms of sustained supports, I almost always brought Gallagher or Lingsha because their break damage bonuses are huge in this strategy. Plus, you absolutely need some sort of healing, because even with the break strategy, sometimes enemies are just gonna recover and hit your team for massive damage. Aventurine can be a nice teammate as well, and so can other sustained teammates, but just make sure you adjust your scepter builds to complement whatever team you're bringing. These builds are very nuanced, and no singular build will work perfectly for multiple teams. My last note is that for the secret final 4th plane error domain things, don't expect to clear those very often when you're playing at Conundrum 6. Luckily, you don't technically need to in order to complete a run, but I know it can be enticing to challenge it. Unfortunately though, unless your scepter builds are pretty much 100% perfect and your team is heavily invested, you'll have a very hard time even getting into this 4th plane, let alone completing it. But yeah, that's essentially the gist of what I consider the easiest strategy for completing the new Unknowable Domain in Simulated Universe. It's a fun new game mode and there's lots of stellar jades to be had, and I personally love that the focus is taken off of your characters and placed more so on crazy scepter builds. If you want the most extensive information available on this break strategy, I highly recommend checking out Sweetely's video on it because she does an excellent job laying out all your possibilities and why each scepter or component works where it does. If you enjoyed my video though, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.